Something unfolded at the bottom of the sea last week, not in a declared war, not during an open conflict. Right in the middle of a negotiation, while diplomats sat across a table in Doha, Qatar, making promises in front of people recording every word, something occurred at the bottom of the Strait of Hormuz that the world's major news outlets covered briefly for 48 hours before quietly moving on. And the reason they moved on is the same reason you should pay attention now. What took place in that strait in the final days of May 2026 was not a simple maritime event. It was a confession about Iran itself, its leadership's beliefs, and the lengths it is willing to go to survive a confrontation it had already lost by every conventional military measure. Mines were placed, strikes executed, nuclear compromises tested, leaked negotiation details circulated, the United States applied quiet pressure on Washington, and the Abraham Accords statement, which seemed optimistic, acted as a precision instrument. After today, you will understand what surface-level reporting has consistently missed. The mainstream coverage gives you explosions, statements, troop movements. It does not show the underlying architecture, the layers beneath the layers, the real moves made by actors who avoid announcing them because doing so would ruin the entire purpose. This is what we are examining. The final part will reveal a picture far more alarming than anything before. The real story begins before any official statement. In the closing days of May 2026, Iranian small boats moved through the southern end of the Strait of Hormuz. Quietly, methodically, and timed in darkness chosen by operational planners, they placed mines in international waters. They were not clearing mines, not conducting safety sweeps, not acting like a nation seeking to reduce tensions in a waterway legally designated by the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea as international. They were placing new mines during an active ceasefire. At the same time, Iranian diplomats at a table in Doha, Qatar, told their counterparts that once a peace agreement was formally signed, Iran would clear mines from the strait as a gesture of good faith. The sequence itself tells the story. Abbas Araghchi, the Iranian foreign minister, made commitments in Doha regarding mine clearance, while Iranian naval units in the southern strait were simultaneously placing new mines in the same waters those promises were meant to protect. Both actions occurred together, authorized, coordinated, or at least known by elements of a government presenting a unified diplomatic front. This does not speak to Iran's military capacity, which has already been dramatically reduced over the past 18 months. It speaks to how Iran's leadership views negotiation. Diplomacy was not a path to resolution. It was cover, to keep the Americans engaged, to maintain a framework that imposes political cost for escalation, while simultaneously executing their actual intentions. In the worldview of those giving the orders, the ceasefire was not a ceasefire. It was a window for repositioning. The U.S. Central Command confirmed the next moves. American forces conducted strikes described officially as self-defense, targeting Iranian naval vessels and related infrastructure, actively placing mines in international waters. The Iranian small boats involved ended up at the bottom of the Strait of Hormuz. CENTCOM emphasized that these strikes were not warnings or symbolic gestures. They removed direct threats to American naval assets and international shipping operating in waters. The U.S. has consistently declared must remain free. What changed everything was the follow-on response. The U.S. did not stop at the boats. Strikes hit military facilities inside Iran. Explosions were reported in Bandar Abbas before the Iranian government could craft a narrative, demonstrating the speed and precision of the operation. Bandar Abbas is critical. It sits on the northern shore of the strait and hosts concentrated naval and air infrastructure, missile batteries, fast attack boat squadrons, coastal radar and electronic warfare systems, command and control for IRGC naval operations, and mine-laying capabilities. These are all positioned to deter adversaries in the world's most crucial maritime choke point. A significant portion was struck by an adversary that had planned these targets for a long time. The strikes sent a clear message. The coordinates of Iran's capabilities were known, and they were removed, not warned. Iran's public response was silent. No dramatic IRGC press conference, no immediate retaliation, no detectable mobilization. Silence was the only rational response, based on operations over the prior 18 months. Strikes on nuclear infrastructure, degradation of air defenses, reduction of ballistic missile capacity. These were not improvised attacks. They were built on a targeting picture developed over years, beginning with the inspection and verification regime under the original 2015 nuclear deal, the JCPOA. Every site documented by international inspectors became part of a database used in operations Iran never fully anticipated. The Bandar Abbas strikes were rapid and complete, showing long-prepared strategic dismantlement executed when legally and operationally justified. Silence afterward does not mean the problem is solved. It signals the conflict has entered a more complex phase. The key question is why the mine-laying order was issued at all. If Iran's conventional military capacity has been significantly reduced and the targeting picture is complete, Why provoke a military response from an adversary? Two explanations exist. First, factionalism. The IRGC is not a fully unified command. It contains competing power centers and interpretations of the revolution. The diplomatic track in Doha reflects pragmatists who understand the strategic reality. The mine-laying represents hardliners who see any deal with Washington as betrayal. If these hardliners executed a mine-laying operation that undermined diplomacy, it shows the government does not fully control its military. The second explanation is calculated leverage. The mine-laying may have been authorized to force a choice on the United States: respond militarily, creating political pressure to accept weaker terms, or do nothing, signaling that violations carry no cost. Either outcome provides Iran negotiating advantage. Both explanations are dangerous. One reveals fractured command, the other shows strategic cynicism. Either way, the Strait of Hormuz cannot be stabilized by negotiation alone if the opposing party either sabotages its diplomacy or treats ceasefire violations as bargaining chips. The military posture behind the Bandar Abbas strikes is not temporary. It must remain credible through any agreement because the behavior that necessitated it has not changed. Now, the real battlefield is not just at sea. In June 2026, the negotiating table in Doha may be as crucial as the physical conflict. What has been unfolding there is a layered strategic chess match requiring simultaneous attention to multiple levels of action. In Doha, Qatar, intensive negotiations continued with Abbas Araghchi, Iran's foreign minister, and Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Speaker of Parliament, both present for extended sessions. Multiple rounds unfolded at once. Several frameworks were discussed simultaneously. Different agendas were layered on top of one another inside the same process. Alongside those meetings, information began appearing across international media outlets. When followed carefully, those disclosures pointed toward a narrative that no official source seemed willing to publicly claim. Reports emerging from several channels suggested that Washington was prepared to accept a nuclear agreement containing terms far more favorable to Iran than battlefield realities appeared to justify. The image presented was of an American administration eager to reach a settlement, willing to ease restrictions on uranium enrichment, willing to accept less demanding verification measures, and prepared to grant Tehran a diplomatic success even after much of its military infrastructure had been dismantled over the previous 18 months. As soon as those details entered the public domain, predictable effects followed. Oil markets reacted, analysts revised their assessments. Political pressure increased on Washington from several directions to accelerate negotiations and accept less restrictive conditions. A critical question follows: who benefited from that narrative appearing at that exact stage of negotiations? It was not Washington. An image of American urgency weakens leverage gained through 18 months of difficult military operations. It was not Iran's hardline faction either. Those elements oppose an agreement regardless of terms. The group that benefited was a different category of actor altogether. These were states with enormous economic exposure to how quickly the crisis ended and under what conditions. They could not openly challenge Washington without risking relationships tied directly to their security. Historically, they have also used the information environment as a diplomatic tool whenever direct pressure was unavailable. Those actors were Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. Their role is central to understanding why the later Abraham Accords statement landed with such precision. Washington answered the leaked narrative neither through retreat nor public justification. Instead, it issued a formal declaration with a clear core position. The United States would not accept any arrangement leaving Iran with a realistic route to nuclear weapons capability, not a delayed route, not a future option hidden behind sunset clauses, no route at all. The statement also introduced a practical proposal that reflected actual movement inside the negotiations. To understand its significance, the nuclear issue must be examined. Iran had been enriching uranium to roughly 60% purity. Weapons-grade material is generally considered to be around 90%. Civilian nuclear energy programs normally require only 3% to 5% enrichment. A 60% stockpile is not a civilian energy reserve. By any technical assessment, it represents a position just below weapons capability. It creates the possibility of reaching weapons-grade levels within weeks rather than months if a political decision is made. That stockpile remained the central technical obstacle throughout negotiations because it sat directly between military concerns and national prestige. Washington's previous position had been straightforward: either transfer the material to the United States for destruction or send it to Russia for storage. Both options required Iran to remove its most symbolically important nuclear material from Iranian territory. For hardliners, either option appeared politically impossible. It would resemble surrender carried out in public view. It would mean relinquishing the one asset they believed compelled adversaries to take them seriously. Iran rejected both proposals. That rejection repeatedly blocked earlier rounds of talks. The new proposal was different. The solution involved downblending. Iran's enriched uranium would remain inside Iran. On Iranian soil, the the 60% material would be mixed with natural or lower enriched uranium, reducing overall enrichment levels to a range suitable for civilian use, somewhere between 3% and 20%. At those levels, the material could support energy production, but would no longer present the same concern regarding a weapons pathway. The entire procedure would occur under continuous supervision from the International Atomic Energy Agency. IAEA inspectors would monitor every phase, verify compliance, and certify the final result. This approach removed the sovereignty objection because no transfer outside Iranian territory would be required. Domestically, the government could present the outcome not as surrender, but as modification. Iran would be adjusting its own material while remaining under international observation rather than handing it over to a foreign state for destruction. Politically, that message is very different. The fact that this proposal appeared in an official statement rather than as an informal trial idea suggested it resulted from genuine movement at the negotiating table in Doha. Something had shifted. This was what that shift looked like once it became visible. Iran's demands were equally revealing. The first demand to attract public attention involved charging ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. After immediate international criticism, the proposal was rebranded. Instead of a transit toll, Iranian representatives began describing it as an environmental fee. The argument was presented as a contribution toward protecting the marine environment of the strait. Vessels moving through the waterway would pay a fee supposedly dedicated to ecological preservation. The framing was notable. Iran, whose economy depends heavily on petroleum extraction and exports moving through that same passage, proposed charging international shipping under an environmental justification. The rebranding was creative. Yet once the language is removed, the destination remains unchanged. Revenue would flow from ships using waters Iran considered its own. The underlying sovereignty claim remained identical to the original toll proposal. No major international actor is likely to accept it. The reason is simple. The moment any country pays such a fee, it implicitly recognizes the authority behind the demand. One does not pay an environmental charge to a state lacking jurisdiction over the area being crossed. Payment becomes recognition. Even a small payment creates precedent. The first tanker making the first contribution to Iranian authorities for passage through the strait would establish something decades of legal efforts and military signaling failed to secure, a precedent suggesting Iran possesses the authority to charge for movement through an international waterway. That precedent would not remain confined to the Strait of Hormuz. It would influence disputed maritime corridors around the world. For that reason, it is not viewed as a simple concession. It represents a red line with consequences extending well beyond the immediate conflict. Iran's second major demand revealed even more about how Tehran viewed its position. Iran requested that China serve as a formal guarantor of any agreement reached in Doha. At first glance, the request appears reasonable. Major agreements often involve guarantor states that commit to supporting and enforcing the terms. But the specific choice matters. China signed a 25-year comprehensive cooperation agreement with Iran in 2021. That arrangement created deep economic interdependence and included heavily discounted oil purchases that helped sustain Iranian revenues during severe sanctions periods. China also maintains an independent strategic interest in reducing American influence throughout the Middle East. That objective is openly documented within its broader foreign policy framework. Iran therefore proposed China, a country with those interests and incentives, as the enforcement mechanism behind a future agreement with Washington. Historical parallels emerge quickly. In 1994, Ukraine surrendered the nuclear arsenal inherited from the Soviet Union under the Budapest Memorandum. In return, Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom guaranteed Ukrainian sovereignty. Ukraine gave up its deterrent on the basis of those assurances. Russia invaded in 2014, and again on a much larger scale in 2022. The guarantees proved ineffective when strategic interests shifted. China's commitments operate according to a similar calculation. They remain intact as long as honoring them costs less than abandoning them. Once that equation changes, the guarantee can disappear. The collapse of the Maduro government in Venezuela during early 2025 illustrated this dynamic. Chinese officials publicly met with Maduro only weeks before the government's fall, reaffirming support and partnership. Yet once the government collapsed, no intervention followed. No enforcement occurred. No accountability accompanied previous public commitments. China's promises are situational rather than permanent. Iran's most sophisticated strategists understand that reality. They know precisely what a Chinese guarantee may be worth when seriously tested. For that reason, the demand was likely not entirely sincere. More likely, it functioned as a bargaining chip designed to be exchanged later for concessions involving issues Tehran considered more important. Determining which demands are genuine red lines and which are merely negotiating tools remains the real contest unfolding inside the Doha talks. The mine-laying operation, the environmental fee proposal, and the Chinese guarantee all fit within the same tactical structure. Increase costs, complicate conditions, extract maximum concessions from a position of weakness by making continued pressure appear more expensive than compromise. At the same time, another pressure campaign was operating against Washington from a different direction. The Gulf states were not passive observers. They were active participants in a specific form of influence effort, and understanding that effort helps explain the significance of the Abraham Accords statement. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE all faced urgent economic exposure tied directly to the outcome and timeline of the conflict. The Strait of Hormuz is not an abstract concept for these governments. It is the route through which Saudi Aramco exports crude oil. It is also the channel through which Qatar LNG reaches international markets, forming the backbone of Qatar's economy. Qatar remains the world's largest LNG exporter. Every week of uncertainty in those waters imposes measurable financial costs on Gulf governments rather than on the United States. These states need the strait functioning normally. The agreement on normalized Arab-Israeli relations represented one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of recent years. At the end of the statement, almost as a side note, there was a suggestion that perhaps the Islamic Republic of Iran might one day find it beneficial to join. On its surface, the statement seemed like aspirational diplomacy, projecting strategic optimism over a region moving in the opposite direction. Turkey, under Erdogan, is not signing a normalization framework with Israel. Pakistan, with domestic politics that make public alignment with Israel nearly impossible, is not joining. Saudi Arabia, where the population remains strongly opposed to normalization since October 2023, faces internal constraints that make any formal Abraham Accords commitment a major domestic liability. Iran joining, a country whose ideology, constitution, and revolutionary structure were built on opposing Israel, is so far outside political reality that including it reads as almost deliberately surreal. So why issue the statement now, during active negotiations, a functioning ceasefire and ongoing violations being processed militarily in real time? The statement was never aimed at Iran. It was not intended for Turkey or Pakistan either. Those were decorative inclusions, giving the statement a broad regional appeal. The real target of the Abraham Accords statement was Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha. These three governments had run information pressure campaigns on American positions that were visible, effective, and consequential enough to require public response. The statement's response was crafted in the language of regional architecture rather than bilateral diplomacy. Translated from diplomatic phrasing, it said, "If you want influence in shaping the post-conflict regional order and to remain relevant in the American framework for the Middle East emerging from this confrontation, you must align with our strategic direction rather than undermine American negotiation positions." The Abraham Accords requirement is not a realistic near-term demand. Every government receiving it understands this. The requirement is a rhetorical line. You cannot simultaneously enjoy American security guarantees and actively weaken American negotiation positions through media pressure. Choose one. Being inside the framework or working against it carries different consequences. Within hours of the statement, organized diplomatic pressure on American positions from Gulf channels decreased noticeably, demonstrating how clearly the message was received. The Abraham Accords statement was not idealistic diplomacy. It was a precisely calibrated public move to neutralize pressure. Looking ahead, as June 2026 begins, the optimistic scenario is a real deal. The downblending compromise proceeds. Iran's enriched uranium stockpile is reduced to civilian-grade material under continuous IAEA verification. Enrichment restrictions are codified in enforceable frameworks rather than self-reporting. The Strait of Hormuz is formally demilitarized under an internationally monitored arrangement allowing political cover for retreat. Sanctions relief is phased against verified compliance rather than preemptive promises. The Islamic Republic survives, reduced in capability and regional projection, but remains a functioning state. The Gulf states achieve stability for economic transformation plans. Global energy markets stabilize. The mechanisms exist. The downblending option is real. Negotiations are functioning. The mutual interest in avoiding escalation is present. The pessimistic scenario is also possible. Hardliners in the IRGC continue operations that sabotage diplomacy. Not to win militarily, they cannot, but because a diminished, constrained Islamic Republic trading nuclear ambitions for economic relief is worse than collapse to them. For some, surviving as a lesser state is a greater defeat than defiant confrontation. If these actors maintain operational autonomy to place mines during a ceasefire, the question of whether that autonomy persists through any Doha agreement is critical. Another scenario exists that neither side discusses. Negotiations succeed on paper but fail structurally. A deal is signed, IAEA inspectors certify downblending. 6 months later, a new enrichment facility operates in a previously untargeted location. Built during the gap between old and new inspection frameworks, it is designed around lessons learned from prior vulnerabilities. Iran's strategic patience is consistently underestimated. Its nuclear program has survived sanctions, targeted killings of senior scientists, military strikes on facilities, and the comprehensive dismantlement campaign of 2024 and 2025. Every setback has been rebuilt with different configurations, but aimed at the same objective. No deal can fully answer what happens when Iran's institutional patience outlasts the international community's attentiveness. Attention, coalitions, and the political will to maintain military posture erode over time as global focus shifts. China watches with precision beyond the Doha Guarantee request. Its 25-year cooperation agreement, discounted oil purchases, and repeated reaffirmations of partnership are strategic investments. Each successful demonstration that Iran can survive American pressure through Chinese partnership validates Beijing's model of multipolar influence. If Iran reaches a deal preserving limited regional relevance and China appears constructive, the narrative gains strategic value beyond the oil discount. If the deal fails, if Iran collapses internally, the guarantee framework proves empty and the narrative shifts entirely. China's stake is a test of whether its strategic partnership model can rival American security in producing outcomes middle powers require. Russia operates in the background for similar reasons. Prior U.S. proposals to ship Iran's enriched uranium to Russia were not concessions. They were Russian insertions. Moscow seeks indispensability in any nuclear arrangement to gain leverage over the post-conflict order. The emergence of downblending inside Iran under IAEA supervision removes Russia from the equation intentionally. By June 2, 2026, Iran had placed mines in the Strait of Hormuz during an active ceasefire while pledging restraint at negotiations. U.S. strikes targeted Iranian naval assets and military infrastructure in Bandar Abbas in response. Conventional Iranian military capacity to escalate is heavily constrained by prior 18 months of operations. Negotiations continue in Doha with downblending formally on the table. Iran demands an environmental fee, essentially a rebranded transit toll and a Chinese guarantee, likely a trading chip. Gulf states run media pressure operations against American positions. Washington countered with the Abraham Accords statement, neutralizing pressure without substantive concessions. The ceasefire remains technically in place, illustrating differing definitions of the term. No one can honestly determine whether the Doha deal will hold once attention shifts. Can hardline IRGC elements continue operations counter to diplomatic agreements? Will the down-blending compromise survive Iran's domestic political environment shaped by hardliners? Will any Chinese guarantee be exercised or abandoned if costly? Are their facilities unknown to inspectors, built with knowledge of past vulnerabilities, operationally ready? The underlying question persists. Can a regime that placed mines in international waters during active negotiations on the same day its diplomats made commitments be a reliable agreement partner? Or is such behavior a method, not an aberration, a revelation of what the ceasefire means to those who agreed to it? The answer is forming somewhere in Doha, somewhere in Iran, and at the bottom of the Strait of Hormuz, where the boats sent into darkness now rest on the seabed. Whatever emerges will determine whether the world's most consequential waterway enters genuine stabilization or a more aggressive phase than before. Watch the next 72 hours in Doha closely. Multiple decisive games are unfolding simultaneously. Something will move, and its direction will answer questions that weeks of managed ambiguity have left open. The boats rest at the bottom of the strait. The question is not just about the mines they carried, but the last credible form of deterrence they represented and what fills the space left behind. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.